I'm a Ukrainian soldier. There's something in the woods besides the Russians. I remember when the first of the Russians attacked back in February 2022, crossing the border like armies of orcs. Though they were unorganized, and many were drunk or poorly trained, there was such a massive number that they still managed to spread chaos and bloodshed everywhere they went. People lived in fear, and many remembered the war crimes committed by the Soviet army in World War II, especially against tens of millions of German women and girls. Ukrainian women and girls near the battlefield lived in constant fear of being kidnapped by Russian soldiers, knowing their long, sick history of committing atrocities against unarmed civilians. Even worse, the Russians had a history of kidnapping children, supposedly to send back to Russia, though many were never seen again. Within days, the Ukrainian government enlisted me. I got sent to the border of Donetsk. When I got to the battlefield, I found a city in flames. "Artem!" my squad leader Dmitry called from the front of the pack. "Keep up." I looked around, realizing I had been daydreaming as we trooped past the miles of rubble and destroyed buildings. Many of the soldiers in front of me were barely men at all, just boys really. Many had only recently graduated high school. They continuously looked around with gleaming eyes and stark fear engraved on their young faces, staying together like a herd of antelope, afraid of the lion. Overhead, I heard the distant roaring of planes and fighter jets. Faint bomb blasts echoed from all corners of the city. I started to jog forward to rejoin the troop when a high-pitched, shrieking whine pierced the winter air directly overhead. I immediately froze, still far behind the last soldier. I looked up and saw a white blur flash through the air, crashing straight down from the sky like a meteor. Before anyone could react, it erupted with a mountain of fire and an earth-shaking cacophony. The flash was like looking into an exploding star, sending me flying backwards. The ground shook and cracked, the deserted street's pavement heaving and trembling beneath me. A long arm of flame reached upwards into the air, expanding and consuming everything around it in a growing inferno. Men screamed all around me. Body parts littered the ground like pieces of litter. I saw Dmitry's head staring up at me from the nearby sidewalk, his eyes still slowly opening and closing. Black smoke erupted in thick plumes all around me, choking and acrid. Groggily, I started to push myself up, seeing all the scrapes and cuts on my body. I had landed hard on my back. I felt something warm and sticky running down it. Fumbling, I reached back and found a sharp rock stuck deeply into my skin. I pulled out the bloody thing with a cry of pain. I felt weak and sick. I bent over, retching. After a few moments, my head seemed to clear, though it still hurt even to breathe. I tested all my limbs and found that they still worked. I was bleeding from dozens of small cuts, but at that moment, that meant less than nothing to me. My adrenaline was so high that I didn't even feel most of them until later. Once I realized everyone else in my troop was either dead or dying, I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. As I looked back at the crater of smoke and broken bodies laying on the street, I realized just how close I had gotten to death. If I had been 20 feet closer. In a blind panic, I sprinted back the way we had come. Homes and apartment buildings in flames sent clouds of smoke into the frigid, cloudless sky, turning the world dark as if a solar eclipse were taking place. The dying screams of my few living comrades followed me out, their voices filled with unimaginable pain and terror as the last few grains on their hourglass descended. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. I existed in a state of animal panic, alone and surrounded by the enemy without my troop. I had lost my radio sometime during the bomb blast and couldn't even call for help. Moreover, I had never been to this part of Ukraine and had no idea where I was going. As soon as I was out of the city, I heard shouting. I looked forward, seeing a line of tanks and soldiers heading towards the entrance to Donetsk. My heart dropped as I realized they were speaking in Russian. Thick woods surrounded both sides of the road. I sprinted blindly into the brush, hoping that they hadn't seen me. After a few minutes of running, I started to slow down, wondering if I had gotten away. I kept glancing back, checking to see if they would send soldiers to follow me. My heartbeat burst in my ears like the rapid beating of some sacrificial drum. I heard the cracking of a twig close behind me. As I turned, I saw the face of a Russian soldier appearing over a bush. His blue eyes looked as cold as ice, the predatory eyes of a killer. Gunshots exploded all around me as I ducked behind a large pine tree, hugging my rifle to my chest. The bullets smashed into the bark of the tree, sending sharp splinters flying in all directions. I had no idea how many there were. When they stopped to reload, I leaned out from behind the tree and sprayed a round of bullets where I had last seen the Russian soldier. Someone screamed as a splash of blood covered the leaves and forest floor. Immediately, another rifle started firing, the bullets whizzing right past my head. I felt a burst of heat on my left hand, then a rising current of agony, sizzling through my nerves. In the heat of the battle, I didn't dare look down even for a moment, but I could feel the blood running over my hand like warm raindrops. With no good options left, I took a grenade out of my belt and pulled the pin. I tossed it as hard as I could in the direction of the enemy, before taking off sprinting across the woods. Someone started shooting, but a moment later, the grenade went off. The rifle immediately fell silent as a high-pitched whine filled my ears, deafening me. I looked down, realizing my pinky and ring fingers were mostly gone. 2 mutilated stubs of fingers, a 1/4 inch long, spurted crimson torrents in time with my heart. I felt lightheaded and sick just looking at the damage. The pain made it hard to think or focus on anything. I existed in a state of pure instinct, just another injured animal running for its life. After a few minutes of blindly sprinting ahead, I had to stop and rest. I sat down on a flat boulder, surrounded by evergreens in the cold, whipping wind of the Ukrainian winter. In my pack, I had bandages, tourniquets, antiseptics, and even a single auto-injector of morphine. I grabbed the syringe and injected it into my tricep. As I cleaned the mutilated hand, I felt a rising sense of peace and tiredness. The pain, while not entirely gone, had grown duller, and now it seemed 1,000 miles away. I started wrapping up my hand with sterile bandages. The spurting blood from my 2 fingers stained the bandages red, forming crimson ink blots that soaked through them instantly. I was exhausted from all the running and fighting. I had, after all, only finished boot camp and training a couple days before, so my body and mind had been pushed to the limit even before Donetsk. I focused on my breathing, feeling the sweet relief of the morphine rushing over my mutilated fingers. I blinked fast. I don't know when, but sometime while wrapping up my hand, I fell asleep. Within moments, I was dreaming of men with cold, blue, predatory eyes looking down on Ukrainian children. Children who screamed and thrashed on surgical tables. Doctors in white lab coats speaking Russian came over to look down on them. With the glittering of a scalpel, the doctors knelt down, and began their grisly work. I woke up suddenly, surrounded by thick blankets of darkness. Overhead, the dim light from the stars and moon barely cut through the wisps of clouds. I estimated that a few hours must have passed, at the very least. It felt like my left hand was being stabbed over and over. The tiny stubs of my fingers felt as if they were burning. Strangely enough, I would have sworn I could still feel the fingers there, almost like some ghostly pins and needles memory of the digits. I gritted my teeth, looking down at my first aid kit. I had used all of the morphine. Swearing, I clawed through the pack until I found some naproxen, then dry swallowed them. I doubted whether the generic Aleve would do much to relieve such a throbbing, unending pain, however. I heard something behind me, a sound that came across as faint as a whisper. It was like the breathing of a sleeping infant, calm and rhythmic. Confused, I pushed myself up and turned on the flashlight attachment to my rifle. I flicked the bright LED light over the bushes and naked leafless trees. "Don't shoot!" a small voice cried in Ukrainian, full of panic. A little girl crawled out from behind a pine tree, her face filthy, her clothes torn and covered in grime. She had slices all over her body. Her blue eyes looked up at me with pain and horror. "Please, don't let them take me again." "Who are you?" I asked, taking a step back. I glanced around, expecting a trap. "You aren't with the Russians, are you?" she said. I just shook my head. "No, I'm not," I said. "Now I asked you, who are you? Where did you come from? How did you find me out here?" "My name is Daniela," she said, brushing a lock of dirty blonde hair out of her eyes. The girl didn't look older than 8 or 9, if I had to guess. I was kidnapped from my parents in Ukraine, along with all the other children in my town. The Russians said they would send me to live with a good Russian family, who would raise me to believe in the values of the true motherland. But I didn't want to go. I got scared. And when the soldier tried to take me from the house, I grabbed a knife off the kitchen table and stabbed him in the leg. They knocked me out, smashing their rifles into my head until I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was with dozens of other children, tied down to steel tables in some concrete basement. They were doing horrible things to the ones on the other side of the room, dissecting them alive and cutting off pieces of their bodies. They worked their way slowly over to me. When the doctors came in with the syringes full of black, glittering fluid, though, things got out of control. I was trying to undo the knot that kept me tied down to the table. My father had insisted I keep a small folding knife hidden on me after the Russians invaded and started kidnapping and murdering children. I had hidden it in my underwear, and after a few minutes, I was able to wriggle around so that I got hold of it. I started sawing through the knot, holding my arms down, when the first children started to change. Their eyes turned as black as pools of oil. Their skin became bloodless and vampiric, and all the horrific wounds they had started to heal. I saw chests stitching themselves back together, ribs regrowing, like fingers reaching out. Their bones lengthened and cracked, twisting and reforming as I watched. Then, the children who had received the injection started to laugh and gnash their mouths together. I saw the doctor stop, looking at each with expressions of horror. One of them started to babble in Russian. "Is this supposed to happen?" he asked, his glasses magnifying his frantic, searching eyes. The children's teeth lengthened and sharpened into long fangs. As they laughed and grinned, I saw with horror that their teeth were black. I felt the rope holding me to the table snap at that moment. The Russians were so distracted by the transformation of the children that they never noticed me sitting up and cutting my legs free. But the transformed children freed themselves at the same time. I heard their ropes snap as a diseased, gurgling laughter ripped its way out of their throats. With jerky, twisting movements, they rose, pushing themselves off the surgical tables. As their black teeth flashed, they launched themselves at the doctors. One girl bit off the head doctor's nose while a Russian soldier screamed orders at her. He came up behind her and stabbed her in the neck, but she held onto the doctor's nose like a dog with a squirrel in its mouth. Black blood the color of charcoal poured from her neck, but her smile never faltered. The other boys and girls with the black eyes attacked the Russians. I didn't look back again, but I ran out of there. The stairway from that room of horrors led up into this forest. Whatever site the Russians used, it was in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't a road or a house nearby. I've been wandering for the last few hours, trying to find my way back to Ukraine and my family. I felt sick listening to this poor girl's story. Of course, I didn't believe much of it. I figured she'd been kidnapped by Russian soldiers and had probably made up a fantasy rather than remembering the actual incomprehensible horrors she must have witnessed or experienced. Yeah, I'm trying to find my way back too, I said, yawning. My entire body hurt. My name's Artem. You can come with me. It will be safer with 4 eyes than with 2 after all. Daniela nodded eagerly. If I had to stay in this dark forest by myself for another hour, I might go insane, she whispered, looking around furtively. I could have sworn I heard soft footsteps and this weird choking laughter while I wandered. When? I asked. How long ago? The terror in her eyes shook me, making me feel uncertain. About 5 minutes before I found you, she said. Without warning, she leapt forward and wrapped her arms around me. Oh God, I was so scared. It's those children changed by the Russians, the children with the black eyes. I just know it. Okay, then come on, I said, pulling her. I looked back in the direction I had come. I think I know the way out of here. The only problem is, it leads towards Donetsk, where the Russians are as thick as fleas. I think we should veer to the left, away from the city. Perhaps we'll come out further down the road and be able to find a Ukrainian unit. Daniela stayed so close to me that I nearly tripped over her multiple times. If I had let her, I'm fairly sure she would have hugged me the entire way. Something's going to try to grab me, she whispered. No, really, it's okay, Daniela, I said, patting her head. You don't have to worry. If someone tries to take you, I'll shoot them, okay? I gave her a small smile. She didn't return it. After a few minutes of walking, I thought I heard faint, diseased breathing far behind us. It was so faint that I could barely tell. But there were other noises too. Footsteps that seemed as light as air and occasionally a small choking laugh, like the laugh of someone with a slit throat. Through the thick trees, I saw the glittering of lights in the distance. With renewed hope, I began running towards what I thought might be a town or a military outpost. Daniela tried to keep up, but she was even more exhausted than I was, and I had to slow down. I think we've almost made it, I exclaimed, my voice echoing loudly all around me in the silence of the forest. As I listened, I realized just how quiet everything was. It seemed like a graveyard. I didn't hear a single animal or bug, a single bird or bat anywhere. There wasn't the sound of people or cars in the distance. It was as if everything had stopped. as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Up ahead of us, I saw the gleam of eyes as black and shining as volcanic glass. A young boy stepped out from behind a bush, clad only in a blood-stained green hospital gown. His arms and legs had become inhumanly long and twisted. At the end of each, sharp, bony claws protruded. He grinned at me and Daniela, showing a mouthful of obsidian fangs. "You must join us, Daniela," he hissed in a dead voice, stepping forward towards us. In his right hand, I saw a needle filled with sparkling black fluid. "It's time for the change." "Go away!" Daniela screamed, pushing her body against mine. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the boy's head. "You heard her," I said as calmly as I could. "Leave us alone. I don't want to hurt you. We are on the same side here." The boy gave a mocking, sardonic laugh at that, a laugh as cold as empty space. "My only side," he hissed, "is vengeance." As he spoke, I heard soft rustling from directly behind us. I glanced back, seeing dozens of pairs of gleaming black eyes staring at me. I screamed, backpedaling. Daniela sprinted blindly away in a panic as the transformed children leapt at us. I felt my foot catch on a rock. I fell backwards, pulling the trigger as these strange, demonic kids oozed towards me. The gun went off with a sound like a sewing machine, spraying bullets in a wide arc in front of me. The nearest of the children, a little girl with stringy black hair and an unhinged jaw like that of a snake's, fell forward as her forehead exploded. I kept pushing myself away from the abominations as they swarmed toward me, taking down a dozen of them before my magazine clicked empty. I heard shouting in Ukrainian nearby and saw the beams of flashlights searching through the forest, coming from the direction where Daniela and I had seen lights through the trees. I screamed as loudly as I could for help. I turned, seeing the changed boy standing there only a few feet away, holding Daniela tightly in one hand. In the other, he held the syringe filled with black fluid. With a sadistic grin and a flash of his demonic teeth, he shoved the needle into her neck and pressed on the plunger. Daniela screamed, choking and gasping as he threw her forward. She fell to her knees. To my horror, when she looked back up, her eyes were black and she had an insane rictus grin plastered across her small face. Ukrainian soldiers sprinted in our direction as I pushed myself blindly in their direction. I cried for help, telling them I was part of the Donetsk regiment, as their lights pushed back the creeping shadows of the forest. I looked over and realized Daniela and the boy were both gone. When I turned to count the bodies of the transformed children, I found that they were all gone as well. The corpses had mysteriously disappeared, leaving only drops of blood as black as soot behind. Aha! You survived the story. Think you can handle how deep, dark, and disturbing the rabbit hole goes? Click on the playlist and let me know in the comments where your breaking point is.